During the 1950s, American families had 30 incredible old-school desserts.
Second dish of this demonstration is called cottage pie. We do start off rather as we did with the other one.
Hiding in their Betty Crocker cookbooks that most people today have completely forgotten. These timeless masterpieces brought entire families together around kitchen tables during some of the most meaningful moments in modern American history. Let's rediscover these forgotten old-school desserts that our grandparents treasured when traditional baking truly mattered. Pineapple. Upside-down cake. Before Pinterest made everything about presentation, there was one old-school dessert that proved flipping things upside down could create pure magic. Pineapple. Upside-down cake wasn't just a recipe. It was a kitchen theater in your home, and every family had their own time-tested technique for getting those perfect golden rings that looked like edible sunshine. The old-school process started with real butter melted in a cast-iron skillet, the kind that had been seasoned by years of Sunday dinners and family gatherings. Brown sugar was sprinkled over that butter, creating a caramel base that would become the crown jewel of the finished cake. Then came the pineapple rings, arranged like perfect circles of tropical paradise, each one nestled with a bright red maraschino cherry in the center. The cake batter was simple but crucial, yellow cake that would complement, not compete with, the fruit. It was poured carefully over the fruit arrangement, covering every inch without disturbing the perfect pattern underneath. Into the oven it went, filling the kitchen with old-school aromas that could draw neighbors from 3 houses away. Lemon chiffon pie. Lemon chiffon pie was the old-school dessert that taught American home bakers they could create restaurant-quality elegance in their own kitchens. This wasn't just lemon meringue's fancy cousin. This was a completely different animal that required traditional technique, perfect timing, and a little bit of faith in the magic of gelatin. The filling was where the old-school magic lived. Fresh lemon juice and zest were combined with egg yolks and sugar, cooked carefully until thick enough to coat a spoon. Then came the gelatin, dissolved and stirred in while the mixture was still warm. But the real secret was the egg whites, whipped to stiff peaks and folded in just as the mixture began to set, creating that signature light, airy texture that made every bite feel like eating a cloud. Banana pudding icebox. Long before banana pudding became a Southern restaurant staple, Betty Crocker's old-school icebox version was teaching families across America that some of the best desserts required no baking at all. This was comfort food, disguised as sophistication, and it converted skeptics with every creamy, banana-laden spoonful. The foundation was vanilla wafers, arranged in precise layers that would soften into cake-like texture as the dessert chilled. Between each layer went sliced bananas, not the green ones we settle for today, but perfectly ripe bananas with brown spots that promised maximum sweetness and flavor. The pudding was made from scratch using old-school methods, cooked on the stovetop until thick and glossy, then cooled just enough to prevent the bananas from turning to mush. Coca-Cola Cake. Coca-Cola Cake proved that sometimes the most unexpected old-school ingredients create the most memorable desserts. This wasn't a gimmick or a novelty. This was serious chocolate cake that happened to get its magic from America's favorite soda, creating flavors that no traditional recipe could match. The cake batter started like any old-school chocolate cake, but then came the twist. Coca-Cola was heated with butter and cocoa powder, creating a syrup that would be the secret to the cake's incredible moisture and unique flavor. The warm Coke mixture was stirred into the batter, along with buttermilk and eggs, creating a thin batter that looked wrong, but baked into perfection. The frosting was where the Coca-Cola really shined in old-school fashion. More Coke was reduced with butter and cocoa, then combined with powdered sugar to create a glossy, fudgy topping that had just a hint of that familiar cola flavor. Applesauce. Spice cake. Applesauce. Spice cake was the old-school dessert that made houses smell like autumn, even in the middle of summer. This wasn't just cake with applesauce thrown in. This was a carefully balanced creation that used applesauce as both moisture and flavor, creating something that was both familiar and sophisticated. The applesauce had to be the right consistency, smooth enough to incorporate evenly, but with enough body to provide structure. Homemade was preferred in old-school kitchens made from apples that had been cooked down with just enough sugar and cinnamon to enhance their natural sweetness. The spice blend was crucial: cinnamon, nutmeg, allspice, and sometimes a touch of cloves, carefully balanced so no single spice overwhelmed the others. The baking process filled the kitchen with old-school aromas that could stop conversations and draw people to the kitchen like magnets. The finished cake was tender and moist, with a crumb so fine it practically melted on the tongue. Sunshine cake. Sunshine cake earned its name from both its golden color and its ability to brighten any occasion using old-school techniques. This was angel food cake's richer cousin, made with egg yolks instead of just whites, creating a tender, buttery crumb that captured sunshine in every slice. The technique required patience and precision that separated experienced bakers from beginners. Egg yolks were beaten until thick and pale, then combined with sugar until the mixture was light and fluffy. Cake flour was folded in gently, along with melted butter and vanilla extract. The key was maintaining the airiness while incorporating enough richness to create that signature golden color and tender texture. The cake was baked in an ungreased tube pan, just like angel food, but the results were completely different. Graham cracker cream pie. Graham cracker cream pie was the old-school dessert that elevated humble crackers into something that could anchor any special meal. This wasn't just pie with graham crackers thrown in. This was a carefully constructed dessert that used those sweet, honey-flavored crackers to create textures and flavors that no traditional pie could match. The crust was pure old-school innovation: graham crackers crushed fine and mixed with butter, then pressed into pie pans and baked until golden. This created a sweet, crunchy foundation that complemented rather than competed with the filling. The filling itself was classic vanilla pastry cream, cooked until thick and glossy using time-tested methods, then cooled until just warm enough to pour without melting the crust. But the real genius was in the layers. Some graham crackers were left in larger pieces and layered throughout the filling, creating pockets of texture that would soften during chilling but maintain just enough crunch to provide interest. Date nut loaf. Date nut loaf was the old-school dessert that bridged the gap between cake and candy, creating something that was sophisticated enough for company but comforting enough for every day. This wasn't fruitcake's heavy cousin. This was something entirely its own, with a texture and flavor profile that converted even the most dedicated date skeptics. The preparation started with dates that were chopped fine and soaked in hot water until they softened into a paste-like consistency. This date mixture was combined with butter, sugar, and eggs, creating a base that was naturally sweet and incredibly moist. Walnuts were folded in for crunch, along with just enough flour to bind everything together using traditional methods. Cornflake Macaroons. Cornflake Macaroons proved that breakfast cereal could become elegant dessert with just a few simple old-school additions. These weren't the coconut macaroons most people knew. These were crispy, golden clusters that delivered familiar flavors in a completely unexpected form. The base was simple but required technique: cornflakes mixed with shredded coconut and bound together with egg whites that had been whipped to soft peaks. Sugar was added gradually, creating a meringue-like mixture that would hold the cereal and coconut together while baking. Some families added a touch of vanilla or almond extract for extra flavor complexity. The shaping was almost meditative. Spoonfuls of the mixture were dropped onto parchment paper, creating rustic clusters that would bake into golden, crispy treats. The oven had to be just right. Hot enough to set the egg whites and toast the cereal, but not so hot that the coconut would burn before the centers were cooked through. Icebox Éclair Cake. Icebox Éclair cake was the old-school dessert that gave home bakers the satisfaction of making eclairs without any of the intimidation factor. This wasn't traditional French pastry. This was American ingenuity at its finest, creating all the flavors and textures of eclairs in a form that anyone could master using time-tested assembly methods. The foundation was graham crackers, arranged in perfect layers that would soften into something resembling pastry as the dessert chilled. Between each layer went vanilla pudding, made from scratch and cooled until thick enough to spread evenly. The assembly required patience. Pudding, crackers, until the dish was full and the top was crowned with a final layer of pudding. The finishing touch was what made this old-school dessert special, a chocolate glaze that was poured over the top and allowed to drip down the sides. Icebox Fruitcake. Icebox Fruitcake revolutionized America's relationship with fruitcake by eliminating everything people hated about the traditional version while keeping everything they secretly loved. This wasn't the dense, boozy brick that became holiday jokes. This was light, fresh, and actually disappeared from serving plates instead of being regifted for decades. The genius was in the old-school construction that required no baking. Instead of forcing fruit into heavy cake batter, this version layered everything cold. Vanilla wafers formed the base, arranged in neat rows that would soften into cake-like texture as the dessert chilled. The fruit component was a mixture of chopped dates, candied cherries, and toasted nuts, all bound together with sweetened whipped cream instead of dense batter. After overnight chilling, the wafers had absorbed moisture and flavors from the fruit mixture, creating something that had all the familiar fruitcake tastes, but with a texture that was light and refreshing rather than heavy and dense. Slices revealed beautiful layers of cream, fruit, and softened wafers, proving that sometimes innovation meant throwing out the rulebook entirely. This old-school dessert appeared at holiday tables where traditional fruitcake had been rejected, converting skeptics and creating new traditions. It represented the American spirit of taking old ideas and making them better, more accessible, and more appealing to modern tastes, while respecting the original intent. 7-Up Lemon-Lime Icebox Dessert. 7-Up Lemon-Lime Icebox Dessert proved that soda could be the secret ingredient that elevated simple old-school desserts into something spectacular. This wasn't just gelatin with soda mixed in. This was a carefully balanced creation that used the carbonation and citrus flavors to create textures and tastes that traditional ingredients couldn't match. The base was lime gelatin, but instead of being dissolved in plain water, it was mixed with hot 7-Up that had been heated just enough to dissolve the gelatin without losing all the carbonation. This created a fizzy, light texture that was unlike any other gelatin dessert. As the mixture began to set, whipped cream was folded in, creating a mousse-like consistency that was both airy and refreshing. Some old-school versions included crushed pineapple or mandarin oranges, adding color and texture to the pale green base. The fruit was drained carefully to prevent excess moisture from interfering with the setting process. Other families preferred to keep it simple, letting the pure lemon-lime flavor take center stage. The finished dessert was served in individual glasses or molded in decorative shapes, creating presentations that looked as good as they tasted. Each spoonful delivered bright citrus flavors with a texture that was part mousse, part gelatin, and completely refreshing. The subtle carbonation provided a slight fizz that made each bite feel celebratory. This old-school dessert appeared at summer gatherings, bridge parties, and any occasion that called for something light and refreshing. It represented the era when gelatin desserts were considered the height of modern sophistication, proving that home cooks could create restaurant-quality presentations with simple ingredients and a little creativity. Seafoam Dessert Salad. Seafoam dessert dessert salad sounds like something from another planet, but this ethereal old-school creation was actually one of the most elegant desserts in Betty Crocker's collection. The name came from its pale green color and incredibly light texture that looked like sea foam frozen in time, creating something that was both beautiful and delicious. The base was lime gelatin mixed with hot water, but the magic happened when the mixture was chilled until it began to thicken, then whipped until it doubled in volume and turned pale and frothy. This technique, similar to making a gelatin mousse, created an incredibly light texture that practically melted on the tongue. Whipped cream was folded into the foamy gelatin mixture, along with carefully chosen additions that would complement the delicate lime flavor. Crushed pineapple was popular, as were miniature marshmallows and chopped nuts. Some families added cottage cheese for extra richness and protein, creating a dessert that was both indulgent and somewhat virtuous. The finished dessert was chilled until set, then served in scoops or slices that revealed a pale green interior studded with colorful additions. The texture was unlike anything else, lighter than mousse, more substantial than whipped cream, with a delicate lime flavor that was refreshing without being overpowering. Seafoam dessert salad appeared at ladies' luncheons, shower parties, and any gathering where presentation mattered as much as taste. It represented the height of old-school gelatin artistry, proving that with the right technique, even simple ingredients could create something that looked and tasted extraordinary. Coffee jelly. Coffee jelly was the old-school dessert that proved gelatin could be sophisticated, adult, and completely irresistible to anyone who appreciated the finer things in life. This wasn't kid-friendly fare. This was elegant dining disguised as simple preparation, creating something that belonged on restaurant dessert menus. The coffee had to be perfect, strong, freshly brewed, and made with quality beans that would hold their flavor through the gelatin process. Unflavored gelatin was dissolved in a small amount of cold coffee, then mixed with the hot coffee and sugar until everything was completely smooth. The key was balancing the coffee strength with sweetness, so the finished product would be flavorful but not bitter. Some old-school families added a touch of vanilla or a splash of cream to mellow the coffee flavor, while others preferred the pure, unadulterated taste of good coffee in solid form. The mixture was poured into molds or glasses and chilled until set, creating individual servings that looked as elegant as they tasted. The finished jelly was typically served with a dollop of whipped cream or a drizzle of cream that would slowly sink into the coffee-flavored gelatin. Each spoonful delivered intense coffee flavor with a smooth, refreshing texture that was completely unlike any other dessert. The combination of familiar coffee taste with unexpected gelatin texture created something that was both surprising and satisfying. Coffee jelly appeared at dinner parties where sophisticated desserts were expected, at adult gatherings where children's tastes weren't a consideration, and any time someone wanted to serve something that was both elegant and refreshing. It represented the era when coffee was considered a luxury ingredient worthy of featuring in special desserts. Snow pudding. Snow pudding lived up to its name by creating something that looked exactly like fresh snow, but tasted like heaven using old-school techniques. This was one of the most visually stunning desserts in the Betty Crocker repertoire, using simple ingredients to create something that looked magical and tasted even better. The base was unflavored gelatin dissolved in lemon juice and water, creating a clear, tart foundation. But the magic happened when this mixture was chilled until it began to set, then whipped vigorously until it turned white and doubled in volume. This process incorporated air throughout the gelatin, creating a texture that was light, fluffy, and remarkably snow-like. Egg whites were whipped separately to stiff peaks, then folded into the foamy gelatin mixture along with sugar and a touch of vanilla. This created a dessert that was part mousse, part meringue, and completely ethereal. The finished mixture was spooned into serving dishes or molded into decorative shapes. The presentation was what made snow pudding special in old-school dining. Served in glass bowls or individual cups, it looked exactly like fresh snow that had been scooped from the yard, but each spoonful delivered bright lemon flavor with a texture that melted instantly on the tongue. Some families garnished it with a few drops of red food coloring to create berries in the snow effects. This dessert appeared at winter holiday gatherings, elegant dinner parties, and any occasion where something both beautiful and refreshing was needed. It proved that sometimes the most impressive desserts came from the simplest techniques, creating magic through skill rather than expensive ingredients. Junket Custard. Junket Custard was the old-school dessert that introduced American families to the gentle art of milk coagulation, creating something that was part pudding, part custard, and completely different from anything else on the dessert table. This wasn't cooking in the traditional sense. This was almost like gentle chemistry that transformed simple milk into silky, delicate custard. The process started with fresh milk heated to exactly the right temperature, warm enough to activate the junket tablet, but not so hot that it would curdle. The junket tablet, made from rennet, was dissolved in cold water and stirred into the warm milk, along with sugar and vanilla. The mixture was then left completely undisturbed to set, usually for several hours or overnight. The result was unlike any other custard that could be achieved through traditional cooking methods. The texture was incredibly delicate and silky, firmer than milk but softer than traditional baked custard. It had a clean, pure flavor that showcased the quality of the milk used, with just enough sweetness to make it feel like dessert rather than a dairy product. Junket custard was typically served in the dishes where it was made, since it was too delicate to unmold successfully. Some families topped it with fresh fruit, others preferred a sprinkle of nutmeg or cinnamon, and the most elegant versions were garnished with a small amount of whipped cream and a single perfect berry. This old-school dessert appeared at refined gatherings where delicate flavors were appreciated, at convalescent meals where gentle foods were needed, and any time someone wanted to serve something that was both nourishing and elegant. It represented an era when desserts could be simple, pure, and focused on showcasing the quality of basic ingredients. Chocolate Haystacks. Chow-Mein cookies. Chocolate Haystacks, also known as Chow-Mein cookies, were the old-school dessert that proved candy and cookies could merge into something that was better than either component alone. These weren't traditional cookies in any sense. They were clusters of chocolate and crunch that required no baking and delivered maximum satisfaction with minimal effort. The base was simple but genius. Chocolate chips or chocolate candy melted until smooth and glossy. Into this chocolate went Chow-Mein noodles, those crispy, crunchy noodles that added texture and visual interest that no traditional cookie ingredient could match. Some families added peanuts or other nuts for extra crunch and flavor complexity. The mixture was stirred until every noodle was coated with chocolate, then spooned onto waxed paper in small mounds that resembled tiny haystacks. As the chocolate cooled and hardened, it bound the noodles together into clusters that were part candy, part cookie, and completely addictive. The finished haystacks had a unique texture that combined the smoothness of chocolate with the crunch of noodles, creating something that was satisfying to eat and fun to look at. The chocolate provided richness, while the noodles added textural interest that kept each bite interesting and unpredictable. These appeared at bake sales, where they always sold first, at holiday cookie exchanges, where they stood out from traditional offerings, and any time someone needed to make a lot of treats quickly. They represented American creativity at its finest, taking ingredients from completely different culinary traditions and combining them into something new and wonderful. Self-saucing, butterscotch, pudding cake. Self-saucing, butterscotch. Pudding cake was the old-school dessert that seemed to defy physics, creating its own sauce while baking and delivering two desserts in one pan. This wasn't magic, though it seemed like it. This was clever technique that used the principles of heat and moisture to create something that looked impossible but tasted incredible. The cake batter was simple: flour, sugar, butter, and milk combined into a basic cake mixture that was spread in a buttered baking dish. The magic happened with the topping. Brown sugar and cocoa powder for chocolate versions, or just brown sugar for pure butterscotch, were sprinkled evenly over the batter. Then hot water was poured carefully over the entire surface. The physics were beautiful to watch unfold. As the dessert baked, the cake batter rose to the top, while the sugar and water mixture sank to the bottom, creating its own caramel sauce through the heat of the oven. What went in looking like a disaster came out as a perfect cake, floating on a pool of rich butterscotch sauce. The serving was part of the spectacle that made this dessert memorable. The cake was scooped from the pan, revealing the golden cake portion and the rich sauce underneath. Each serving got both components, creating a dessert that was warm, comforting, and completely satisfying. The cake was tender and moist, while the sauce was rich and buttery with deep caramel flavors. This old-school dessert appeared at family dinners where something warm and comforting was needed, at potluck gatherings where impressive presentations mattered, and any time someone wanted to serve something that would generate conversation and requests for the recipe. Brown sugar dumplings. Brown sugar dumplings were the old-school dessert that turned simple syrup into a vehicle for delivering pure comfort in dumpling form. This wasn't fruit cobbler or traditional dumplings. This was something uniquely American that combined the satisfaction of bread with the sweetness of candy in one perfect spoonful. The syrup came first. Brown sugar, butter, and water cooked together until bubbling and smooth, creating a rich caramel base that would both flavor and cook the dumplings. Some families added a touch of vanilla or cinnamon to the syrup, while others preferred the pure, unadulterated taste of caramelized sugar that spoke for itself. The dumpling dough was simple but crucial. Flour, sugar, baking powder, and milk combined into a soft dough that would steam rather than bake in the hot syrup. The dough was dropped by spoonfuls into the bubbling syrup, where it would cook through steam and heat, absorbing flavors while maintaining a tender, bread-like texture. The cooking process was almost meditative, watching the dumplings puff and cook in the golden syrup, filling the kitchen with aromas of caramelized sugar and warm bread that could draw people from every corner of the house. When done, the dumplings were tender and sweet, having absorbed syrup flavors throughout while maintaining their structure. This old-school dessert was served warm, with the dumplings ladled from the pot, along with generous amounts of the rich syrup that had cooked them. Each bite delivered sweet, tender dumplings surrounded by buttery caramel sauce. It appeared at family dinners where comfort food was the goal, at church suppers where satisfying desserts were needed, and any time someone wanted to create something that felt like a warm hug in dessert form. Oatmeal pie. Oatmeal pie was the old-school dessert that proved breakfast ingredients could create something worthy of the finest dinner parties. This wasn't oatmeal cookies in pie form. This was a rich, custard-like creation that used oats to create textures and flavors that no traditional pie could match. The filling was where the magic happened through careful balance of ingredients. Oats were combined with eggs, corn syrup, brown sugar, and butter, creating a mixture that would set into something resembling pecan pie, but with its own unique character. The oats provided texture and nutty flavor while absorbing the sweet custard mixture during baking. Some old-school versions included coconut or chopped nuts for additional texture, while others relied on the oats alone to provide interest and substance. The key was balancing the liquid ingredients so the filling would set properly without becoming too dense or too loose. Vanilla extract was essential for rounding out the flavors and preventing the pie from tasting too much like actual oatmeal. The baking process transformed the simple ingredients into something elegant and sophisticated. The top developed a golden crust, while the interior remained creamy and rich, with the oats distributed throughout in a pattern that looked almost like pecan pie from a distance, but delivered its own unique satisfaction. The finished pie was rich, sweet, and surprisingly sophisticated, with a texture that was part custard, part cookie, and completely satisfying. It appeared at holiday tables where traditional desserts were expected, but something different was desired, at potluck gatherings where unique contributions were valued, and any time someone wanted to prove that simple ingredients could create extraordinary results. Ready for wartime genius? 2430 are pure. How is that a dessert? Mayonnaise, chocolate cake. Mayonnaise, chocolate cake sounds like a mistake until you taste it. And then it becomes the chocolate cake recipe you'll never want to give up. This wasn't wartime desperation. This was pure old-school genius disguised as necessity, creating the moistest, richest chocolate cake anyone had ever experienced using an ingredient that seemed completely wrong but was absolutely perfect. The science was beautiful, even if people didn't understand it at the time. Mayonnaise is essentially eggs and oil emulsified together, which meant this cake was getting perfectly blended fats and proteins without any of the work of creaming butter or separating eggs, completely into the batter, leaving no trace of its origin but contributing moisture and richness that traditional methods couldn't match. The batter looked wrong to anyone watching, thin, almost too liquid, with that slight tang from the mayonnaise that seemed like it would ruin everything. Experienced old-school bakers knew to trust the process, watching as the oven transformed this unlikely mixture into something that rose perfectly and filled the kitchen with the most incredible chocolate aroma. The finished cake was revelation in every bite, moist beyond belief, with a crumb so tender it practically melted on the tongue, a chocolate flavor that was pure and intense without any competing flavors. The mayonnaise had done its job completely, contributing everything good about eggs and oil while disappearing entirely from the taste profile. This cake appeared at gatherings where people expected ordinary chocolate cake and got something extraordinary instead. Quests for the recipe were always met with disbelief, then demands for proof, then conversion. It represented the kind of innovation that happened when limitations forced creativity, proving that sometimes the most unlikely ingredients created the most memorable results. The reveal moment became legendary in many households. Proud bakers would wait until guests had finished their second slice before casually mentioning the secret ingredient. The shocked silence that followed was always worth the wait, followed by demands to see the actual mayonnaise jar as proof. Some guests refused to believe it until they watched the cake being made from start to finish, witnessing the transformation of sandwich spread into dessert perfection. The recipe, spread through neighborhoods like wildfire, passed from kitchen to kitchen by women who understood that sometimes the most extraordinary discoveries came from the most ordinary pantry staples. Wacky, crazy cake. Wacky cake earned its name honestly. This was an old-school cake that broke every rule of traditional baking and somehow created something better than recipes that followed all the proper techniques. No eggs, no butter, no milk, no mixing bowls, and definitely no logic that any traditional baker could understand. In an era when baking was considered a precise science, requiring expensive ingredients and careful technique, this recipe proved that chaos could create perfection. The method was as crazy as the name suggested. Flour, sugar, cocoa powder, baking soda, and salt were mixed directly in the baking pan. No separate bowl required. Then 3 wells were made in the dry ingredients, and into these went vegetable oil, white vinegar, and vanilla extract. Water was poured over everything, and the whole mixture was stirred right in the pan until just combined. The sight of this preparation horrified traditional bakers who had spent years learning proper creaming methods and careful incorporation techniques. The chemical reaction was what made this old-school cake work like magic. The vinegar and baking soda created the leavening, while the oil provided moisture and richness. The lack of eggs meant the cake had a unique texture, tender but sturdy, moist but not dense, with a chocolate flavor that was clean and pure. The acid-base reaction happened instantly when the vinegar hit the baking soda, creating bubbles that would lift the cake during baking without any need for beaten eggs or creamed butter. The beauty of this method was its foolproof nature that even children could master. There was no way to overbeat the batter because there was barely any mixing involved, no risk of curdled butter or deflated eggs because neither ingredient was present, no worry about ingredient temperatures because everything went in at room temperature. Children could make this cake successfully, and busy mothers could throw it together in minutes when unexpected company arrived. The baking process was completely different from traditional cakes. This batter was thinner, more like thick liquid than traditional cake batter, but it rose beautifully and baked into something that looked completely normal from the outside. The real surprise came with the first bite. This wrong cake tasted absolutely right. The crumb was incredibly tender, the moisture was perfect, and the chocolate flavor was pure and intense without any competing elements. Wacky cake became famous during the Depression and World War II, when traditional ingredients were scarce or expensive, but it remained popular long after prosperity returned because it was simply better than many traditional chocolate cakes. Rationing had forced innovation, and that innovation had produced something superior to what abundance had created. It proved that sometimes throwing out the rule book led to the best discoveries, and that necessity truly was the mother of invention. The cake's reputation grew beyond its practical origins to become a symbol of American ingenuity in the kitchen. Experienced bakers who had initially scoffed at the unconventional method found themselves quietly adopting it for their own kitchens, amazed that something so simple could produce results that rivaled their most treasured traditional recipes. The one-pan preparation became a selling point in its own right. Less cleanup meant more time to enjoy the company of family and friends, which was really what home baking was all about. Tomato soup cake. Tomato soup cake was the old-school dessert that made people question everything they thought they knew about baking, then made them believers with the first bite. It wasn't a savory cake or some weird experiment. This was legitimate spice cake that used condensed tomato soup to create moisture, color, and subtle flavor complexity that traditional ingredients couldn't match. Campbell's Soup Company actually promoted this recipe, understanding that creative uses for their products would increase sales during tough economic times. The soup wasn't just thrown into regular cake batter. The entire recipe was built around working with this unconventional ingredient. Tomato soup provided liquid, some sweetness, and a slight acidity that would react with the baking soda to create perfect texture. Spices like cinnamon, nutmeg, and cloves were essential for creating the familiar spice cake flavor profile while masking any hint of tomato. The soup's consistency was perfect for cake batter. Thick enough to provide structure, liquid enough to create moisture. Transformation was remarkable to witness. The soup, which smelled distinctly of tomatoes and herbs in the can, became something entirely different when combined with sugar and spices. The tomato flavor didn't disappear. It transformed into a subtle complexity that enhanced the other flavors without being identifiable. The natural umami in the tomatoes actually improved the overall taste profile, adding depth that traditional spice cakes often lacked. The batter had an unusual orange-red color that looked completely wrong for dessert, but experienced old-school bakers knew to trust the process. The soup dissolved completely during mixing, contributing its moisture and subtle flavors, while the spices took center stage. The finished batter looked like traditional spice cake, with no hint of its unusual main ingredient. The color mellowed during baking, becoming a rich, warm brown that suggested spices rather than vegetables. Baking process filled the kitchen with familiar spice cake aromas, and the finished product looked completely normal, golden brown with a fine, tender crumb. The real test came with tasting, and this cake passed with flying colors. Moist, flavorful, and perfectly spiced, with absolutely no hint of tomato in the finished product. The texture was exceptionally tender, and the flavor was more complex and interesting than traditional spice cakes made with conventional ingredients. This old-school cake appeared at gatherings where people thought they were getting traditional spice cake, only to discover they'd been eating tomato soup all along. The reveal always generated amazement and requests for the recipe, proving that sometimes the most unexpected ingredients created the most memorable desserts. Children who refused to eat vegetables would devour this cake, never knowing they were consuming tomatoes in dessert form. It represented Depression-era creativity at its finest, using shelf-stable ingredients to create something both economical and delicious. Vinegar Pie. Vinegar pie was the old-school dessert that proved desperation could create delicacy, turning one of the most unlikely ingredients into something that tasted remarkably like lemon meringue pie. This wasn't a mistake or a joke. This was legitimate pie that used vinegar's acidity to create the same bright, tart flavors that expensive lemons provided, making elegant dessert accessible during the hardest times. In households where lemons were a luxury that appeared only at Christmas, vinegar became the miracle ingredient that could satisfy cravings for citrus brightness any time of year. The filling was pure chemistry, disguised as cooking. Apple cider vinegar was combined with water, sugar, eggs, and a small amount of flour, creating a custard base that would set during baking. The vinegar provided the essential acidity that made the pie taste bright and fresh, while the sugar balanced the tartness into something that was surprisingly pleasant. The transformation was almost magical, harsh, pungent vinegar becoming something delicate and refined through the alchemy of heat and sweetness. The key was using the right vinegar in the right proportions. Too much, and the pie would be inedibly sour. Too little, and it would be bland and sweet. Apple cider vinegar was preferred for its slightly fruity undertones, while white vinegar was too harsh for most palates. Some bakers added a touch of lemon extract if available, but the vinegar alone was sufficient to create the desired flavor profile. Experienced pie makers could taste the filling before baking and adjust the balance perfectly, creating consistency that even expensive ingredients couldn't guarantee. The baking process was crucial. The filling had to set without curdling, requiring gentle heat and careful timing. When done properly, the pie had a smooth, custard-like filling with a golden color and a flavor that was remarkably similar to lemon curd. A meringue topping was traditional, completing the illusion and adding sweetness to balance the tart filling. The meringue also provided visual appeal, creating a dessert that looked every bit as elegant as its expensive counterpart. People who tasted vinegar pie without knowing the ingredients often guessed it was lemon, testament to how successfully this humble ingredient could masquerade as something much more expensive. Children who had never tasted real lemon pie couldn't tell the difference, while adults who knew both versions often admitted to preferring the vinegar version for its more consistent flavor. It appeared on tables during the Depression and wartime, proving that good dessert didn't require expensive ingredients, just creativity and understanding of how flavors worked together. The serving ritual became part of the pie's charm. Experienced bakers would slice it with theatrical flair, watching guests' faces transform from polite acceptance to genuine surprise and delight. The pie cut cleanly, revealing that perfect custard filling that looked exactly like its lemon counterpart, but somehow tasted even better. Some families made it a game, challenging dinner guests to identify the mystery ingredient that created such bright, clean flavors. Saltine cracker pie, mock pecan, Saltine cracker pie was the old-school dessert that proved texture could be just as important as flavor, creating something that looked, felt, and almost tasted like expensive pecan pie, using nothing more than crackers, eggs, and sugar. This wasn't just making do. This was culinary alchemy that transformed humble ingredients into something that could fool even sophisticated palates. In regions where pecan trees didn't grow and imported nuts were prohibitively expensive, this recipe democratized one of the South's most beloved desserts. The secret was in the preparation of the crackers. Saltine crackers were broken into pieces, not crushed to crumbs, but broken into irregular chunks that would mimic the size and shape of pecan pieces. These were mixed with beaten eggs, corn syrup or sugar syrup, and vanilla extract, creating a filling that looked remarkably similar to traditional pecan pie filling. The breaking technique mattered enormously. Pieces that were too small would dissolve during baking, while pieces that were too large would remain obviously cracker-like. The magic happened during baking. The crackers absorbed the sweet custard mixture while maintaining their shape and providing textural interest that was surprisingly similar to nuts. The saltiness of the crackers provided a subtle contrast to the sweet filling, creating the same sweet-salty balance that made pecan pie so appealing. As the pie baked, the crackers softened and darkened, taking on the appearance of nuts suspended in golden custard. When sliced, the pie revealed what looked like pecan filling studded with nuts, but closer inspection showed the telltale square edges of cracker pieces. The texture was remarkably convincing. The crackers had softened just enough to lose their crispness, while maintaining enough structure to provide the chewiness that people expected from pecan pie. The flavor was rich and sweet, with just enough saltiness to create complexity. This old-school pie appeared at gatherings where people expected traditional pecan pie and got something that was 95% as satisfying for a fraction of the cost. The reveal always generated amazement and disbelief, followed by requests for the recipe. Some people actually preferred it to real pecan pie, claiming the crackers provided better texture consistency than nuts, which could be tough or stale. It represented the height of Depression-era resourcefulness, proving that with enough creativity, almost any expensive ingredient could be successfully imitated. Mock apple pie, Ritz. Mock apple pie using Ritz crackers was perhaps the most famous fake-out in American baking history, and for good reason. This impossible creation actually worked, creating something that tasted convincingly like apple pie using no apples whatsoever. This wasn't desperation cooking. This was magic disguised as necessity, proving that texture and flavor could be manipulated in ways that defied all logic. The recipe became so famous that Ritz crackers still prints it on their boxes today, a testament to how well this impossible substitution worked. The genius was in understanding what made apple pie appealing. It wasn't just the apples, it was the tender texture, the sweet tart flavor, and the way fruit absorbed spices during baking. Ritz crackers, when broken and soaked in a lemon sugar syrup, could mimic all of these characteristics with startling accuracy. The crackers' buttery flavor actually enhanced the illusion, providing richness that complemented the fake fruit filling perfectly. The preparation was almost ritualistic. Ritz crackers were broken into irregular pieces and layered in a pie shell, then covered with a syrup made from water, sugar, lemon juice, and cream of tartar. Cinnamon and nutmeg were essential for creating the familiar apple pie spice profile. The mixture was topped with dots of butter and a second crust, then baked until golden. The cream of tartar was crucial. It provided additional tartness and helped the syrup achieve the right consistency. The chemistry was beautiful. The crackers absorbed the lemony syrup and softened into something that had the texture of cooked apples, while the lemon provided the tartness that people expected from apple pie. The spices completed the illusion, creating a flavor profile that was remarkably convincing. During baking, the crackers released their buttery flavor into the syrup, creating richness that actual apples couldn't match. When served, even people who knew the secret had trouble believing their taste buds. The pie looked exactly like apple pie, with tender fruit-like pieces visible through the crust. The flavor was so convincing that many people preferred it to actual apple pie, claiming it was more consistent and never disappointing like real apples could be. The texture was perfect, tender but not mushy, with just enough substance to feel satisfying. This pie became legendary during the Depression and World War II, when apples were expensive or unavailable. It appeared at church suppers and family gatherings where people expected apple pie and got something that was somehow both fake and better than the real thing. The recipe spread through communities like wildfire, shared by women who took pride in their ability to create something special from nothing. It represented the ultimate triumph of ingenuity over limitation, proving that American creativity could overcome any shortage or hardship. Potato candy. Potato candy was the old-school confection that proved vegetables could become dessert with just a few simple additions, creating something that was both familiar and completely unexpected. This wasn't Irish candy or European tradition. This was pure American innovation that turned leftover mashed potatoes into something that could satisfy any sweet tooth. In an era when wasting food was considered sinful, this recipe transformed dinner leftovers into treats that rivaled expensive store-bought confections. The base was simple: cold mashed potatoes, preferably leftover from dinner and completely smooth. These were mixed with powdered sugar, vanilla extract, and sometimes a touch of salt, creating a mixture that could be shaped and molded like clay. The potatoes provided moisture and binding, while the sugar created sweetness and structure. The key was using potatoes that had been properly seasoned during dinner. A little butter and salt in the original mash actually improved the candy's final flavor profile. The transformation was almost magical. What started as ordinary mashed potatoes became something entirely different when combined with enough powdered sugar to change both texture and taste. The mixture had to reach the perfect consistency, pliable enough to work with, but firm enough to hold its shape. Experienced candy makers could tell by feel when the ratio was exactly right, adding sugar gradually until the mixture stopped being potato and became confection. The shaping was where creativity shined. The mixture could be rolled flat and spread with peanut butter, then rolled into logs and sliced into pinwheels that looked like professional candies. It could be formed into small balls and rolled in coconut or chopped nuts, creating bite-sized treats that resembled expensive truffles. Some families pressed it into molds or simply cut it into squares like traditional fudge, dusting the pieces with cocoa powder or cinnamon sugar. Carrot fudge. Carrot fudge was the old-school candy that made vegetables into indulgence, creating something that looked like traditional fudge but delivered unexpected flavors and textures that were somehow better than the original. This wasn't health food disguised as candy. This was legitimate confection that used carrots to create moisture, color, and subtle sweetness that refined sugar alone couldn't provide. In households where every ingredient had to earn its place, carrots proved they belonged in the dessert course just as much as the dinner plate. The preparation started with carrots that were cooked until completely tender, then mashed or pureed until perfectly smooth. This carrot puree was combined with butter, powdered sugar, and vanilla extract, creating a mixture that had the consistency of traditional fudge, but with a beautiful orange color and subtle vegetable sweetness. The carrots had to be cooked just right. Too firm, and they wouldn't puree smoothly. Too soft, and they would become watery and affect the fudge's texture. The selection of carrots mattered enormously. Young, sweet carrots produced the best flavor and color, while older, larger carrots could be woody or bitter. Some families preferred to use baby carrots when available, claiming they created a more delicate flavor. The cooking liquid was always saved and used for other purposes. Nothing was wasted in households that understood the value of every ingredient. The cooking process was crucial. The mixture had to be heated just enough to blend the flavors and create the right consistency without becoming too thick or too loose. Some recipes included a small amount of cream or milk to adjust the texture, while others relied on the natural moisture from the carrots to create the perfect consistency. The mixture was stirred constantly during heating to prevent scorching, and experienced candy makers could tell by the way it pulled away from the sides of the pan when it was ready. Prune whip. Prune whip was the old-school dessert that rehabilitated one of America's most maligned fruits, transforming wrinkled, unappealing prunes into something light, elegant, and genuinely delicious. This wasn't medicine disguised as dessert. This was sophisticated confection that used prunes' natural sweetness and rich flavor to create something that could anchor the finest dinner parties. In an era when prunes were primarily associated with digestive health, this recipe proved they belonged in the realm of elegant entertaining. Water pie. Water pie was the old-school dessert that proved you could make something from absolutely nothing, creating legitimate pie filling using ingredients so basic that the name itself seemed like a joke. This wasn't starvation food. This was Depression-era genius that used chemistry and technique to create custard-like filling from water, flour, sugar, and vanilla, somehow producing something that was both satisfying and genuinely delicious. In households where every penny counted and luxury ingredients were impossible dreams, this pie represented hope disguised as dessert. The method seemed impossible to anyone familiar with traditional custard pies. Water was heated with sugar until dissolved, then a mixture of flour and more water was stirred in to create thickening. Vanilla extract and a small amount of butter were added for flavor and richness, creating a mixture that looked like thin custard but seemed too simple to work. The proportions had to be exact. Too much flour and the filling would be gummy, too little and it wouldn't set properly. The technique required understanding chemistry without formally studying it. The flour had to be mixed with cold water first to prevent lumps, creating a slurry that would blend smoothly into the hot sugar water. The mixture was cooked briefly on the stovetop, just long enough to begin the thickening process without overcooking the flour. The vanilla and butter were stirred in off the heat, preserving their delicate flavors. The magic happened during baking. The flour mixture thickened further in the oven's heat, creating a filling that set into something resembling traditional custard pie. The bottom crust absorbed some of the moisture while providing structure, and the top developed a delicate skin that looked remarkably like real custard. The baking temperature had to be carefully controlled. Too hot, and the filling would curdle or break. Too cool, and it would never properly set. The finished pie was a testament to the power of technique over ingredients. The filling was smooth, sweet, and surprisingly satisfying, with a vanilla flavor that was clean and pleasant. The texture was lighter than traditional custard, but substantial enough to feel like legitimate dessert rather than flavored water. Each slice held together perfectly, revealing a pale, creamy filling that defied its humble origins. Water pie appeared on tables during the worst of the Depression, when even basic baking ingredients were luxuries that many families couldn't afford. It proved that dessert was possible even when nothing seemed available, representing the ultimate triumph of human creativity over seemingly impossible limitations. This pie was proof that sometimes the most extraordinary achievements came from the most ordinary materials, and that the desire for sweetness and comfort could overcome any obstacle, no matter how insurmountable it might seem. These 30 forgotten old-school desserts tell the story of an America that baked from the heart, not from convenience. Every recipe represents families who understood that dessert was about more than just satisfying sweet cravings. It was about creating moments, building traditions, and showing love through the simple act of making something by hand using time-tested methods. Your great-grandmother didn't just follow these old-school recipes, she lived them. She understood that the best desserts brought people together, that sugar and flour could create magic through traditional techniques, and that some methods were worth preserving no matter how much the world changed around them. These weren't just instructions on cards, they were love letters written in butter and vanilla, passed down through generations who believed that homemade sweetness was life's greatest comfort. Maybe it's time we remembered what she knew about old-school baking. Maybe it's time we brought back the kind of dessert making that created memories instead of just satisfying hunger. Because somewhere in these forgotten old-school recipes lies the secret to bringing families back to the table, neighbors back to each other's kitchens, and communities back to the simple pleasure of sharing something wonderful that was made with care using traditional methods. The old-school recipes are still there, waiting in old cookbooks and handwritten cards. The only question is, are we brave enough to try them again?